right side and her lap.
The Family of Saltimbanques is Picasso's first major picture, whose scale and complexity clearly indicate he intended it to be a masterpiece. In spite of the fact that it's 75 years old, the Family of Saltimbanques has never been examined as one would examine an old master painting. In order to focus on the picture, it is first necessary to bring together two different kinds of detective procedures. The first of these is to examine what has been recorded about the picture, and the second is to look at it through the eyes of science. On a visible level, the characters in the picture are saltimbanques, or wandering entertainers. As Rilke wrote in his elegy, which was inspired by the painting, "But tell me, who are they, these acrobats, even a little more fleeting than we ourselves, so urgently ever since childhood, wrung by an oh for the sake of whom never contented will?" Rilke's question, who are they, finds part of its answer in the costumes of the figures, as Picasso has presented them as Harlequin, as Jester, as Columbine. These costumes identify the figures as belonging to the tradition of the Commedia dell'arte. And the Commedia dell'arte in France reaches its highest point in the court at Versailles. By the time of Louis XIV, the Commedia had acquired a very real presence at the French court. The Commedia itself was an Italian invention, when groups of wandering saltimbanques merged together to form more permanent companies. Certain performers, Harlequin and Columbine, were developed in response to the French court. Another character invented in France was Perrault or Gilles, who is often played in a puffy, loose white costume. Harlequin in particular became a favorite of the king, and Harlequin alone was allowed to speak directly to the king. The freedom of exchange between Harlequin and the king annoyed Madame de Maintenon, the king's mistress, and in 1697 she had the Commedia banned from the court. Over a gradual period of time, the Commedia dell'arte performers returned to their origins as saltimbanques, as wandering entertainers. We can see this in many paintings of the 19th century. Daumier recorded them moving through the streets of Paris, carrying their bench or chair upon which to perform. Manet made references to the saltimbanque tradition by showing a group at rest in an empty countryside. Cezanne draws upon the tradition of the Commedia dell'arte character, while Seurat, for example, records the entertainers performing on the streets of Paris. In 1900, Picasso left Spain for Paris. He was 19. He knew this tradition before he left, as we can see in a poster which employs the figure of Perrault celebrating New Year's Eve. Upon his arrival in Paris, he immerses himself into the Parisian world. Not only the life of Paris, but also the ongoing modern art. The work of Degas, the work of Toulouse-Lautrec, the work of the Impressionists, their themes of cafe life, of people on the street. All of these themes are picked up by Picasso as well, including, ultimately, the Harlequin. But that figure, with its withdrawn, melancholy air, predicts what will happen to Picasso in 1902, when he can't make a go of it in Paris and is forced to return to Spain. Only in 1904 does he have another chance at the city. When he returns to France, as fortune has it, Picasso moves into a studio in a large apartment building called Le Bateau Lavoir. and there renews his friendship with the poet Max Jacob, a poet he'd known from his earlier visit. And through Jacob and this studio location, begins to meet other young poets in France, including Apollinaire and André Salmon. And literally through this studio location, meets a neighborhood girl, Fernande Olivier, who eventually moves in with him in his studio in the Bateau Lavoir. These new friendships become fast and strong ones, and soon this group, who are called Le Band Picasso, become almost inseparable. They spend their time wandering the streets of Montmartre together, where Picasso begins to see the imagery of the street entertainer.
Mosaïque entre toutes, je participe. Je dis que jamais, je participe.
It's also with these friends that he first begins to attend the circus in the fall of 1904 and begins the theme of the Saltimbanque. As his mistress later recalled, Picasso would stay there all evening, talking to the clowns. He admired them, and he had real sympathy for them. Perhaps it's by fortune that Picasso responded to the sense of the lives of the performers off stage with their families in such a way that these images fill the paintings and drawings which follow his first visits to the circus. These circus works are what create the Rose period. In writing about the period of the Family of Saltimbanques, the early Rose period, an art historian observed that chronologically we're entering the unknown. The sequence of images, how they all fit together, remains uncharted. As Picasso's mistress said, the blue period gave way to the Saltimbanques. She further recalled, the first of these was a large canvas, a group of acrobats on a plane. Some are resting, the others working. A child is trying to balance on a large ball. If I remember correctly, this canvas was repainted several times. This large painting has never been found. The imagery Olivier described is known today from a small gouache study where the performing figures she mentioned are present, seen performing in an empty, barren landscape, the same kind of landscape which we find in the family of Saltimbanques. In one sketch for the painting, the landscape is not so barren, because here Picasso indicates a horse race taking place on the outskirts of Paris. Within this study, we find that many of the characters assume the positions they have in the final picture, but they are different in their costume. Another difference involves the basket of flowers next to the little girl. In a separate study, she is shown petting a small dog. Is it possible that at one point the family of Saltimbanques resembled the study very closely, and that at a later time Picasso revised the picture to its present appearance? The reasons for his doing so may reflect an episode in his own life, which moved him emotionally and artistically, because ultimately the figures in the painting become, in fact, emblems of the people in Picasso's life. The tall figure on the left is given a harlequin suit, but more importantly, given the face of the artist himself. The red jester, portly, already resembles Apollinaire, while the figure of the boy with the barrel is in his physique and in many ways in his face an image of André Salmon. And the small acrobat on the right can be seen as a portrait of Max Jacob. And the little girl may be the clue to the meaning of the picture itself. During this period, Olivier decided to adopt, on a trial basis, a small girl from an orphanage. Olivier kept the child for several days in the Bateau Lavoir, where she became very popular with Picasso and Salmon and Jacob, but not ultimately with Olivier, who had her returned to the orphanage, despite the objections of the others. Perhaps Picasso saw in the theme of the wandering entertainer a metaphor for the wandering, homeless life of the adopted girl herself. And by making only the slightest changes, could introduce not a different, but a concurrent theme into the grand painting itself. With the completion of the family of Saltimbanques, Picasso drops the theme of the Commedia dell'arte performer until 1909, in the beginning of his Cubist period, when suddenly a harlequin image returns to his work. These images continue throughout his career, including the very poignant portrait of his son, Paolo, as Harlequin. In 1914, the painting was purchased by a German gallery named Tannhauser, and the gallery took the painting to Munich, where in 1915 it was sold to a private collector and remained off view until the end of the 1920s. In 1931, the painting was sold to Chester Dale of New York. The Dales took the painting to their apartment, but they also allowed scholars, critics, authors access to the picture, so that although it was not on public view, it began to appear in articles and books on Picasso. And in 1952, it came on a long-term loan to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where it has been on public view ever since. The painting is now part of the National Gallery's permanent collection. What we ought to do is in the summer of 1980, the family of Saltimbanques is brought to the conservation laboratories of the National Gallery, where it will undergo the first technical examination in the painting's history. We ought to start probably with this head here, since it's repainted, and maybe look at this area up here, but I'm not sure. What do you think?
That seems fine. What about this area where there's that crackle, which probably indicates there's several layers of paint? Is something going on over his head?
Yeah, we should look at that. And I'm not sure about his head, whether, is it worth going in there or not?
Might as well try it. The heads are going to be the easiest to read, and we'll be able to figure out where we are from that.
Simply looking at the surface of the picture reveals that changes have been made in certain areas. But in order to find out what those revisions might have been, it's necessary to make an X-ray. Because of that study with the horse race, I'd like to go all the way across.
Just all the way?
Yeah, just block the whole thing out.
That may be hard to read since there are no faces.
Yeah.
But we can try.
But I'd come all the way down this figure, since you can see already.
The changes there already.
Yeah, so let's start there.
Fine.
We'll probably have to do the whole thing, actually, if we find anything.
Okay.
Close study of the young acrobat reveals the profile of his legs clearly visible beneath the blue puffy pants that he now wears. This change matches the costume of tights seen in the early study, showing the horse race in the background. By X-raying the picture, we may be able to determine, partially at least, what that original paint layer was underneath the surface of the picture. If you can understand the stages in developing this picture, then you can understand Picasso's own mind during this crucial one-year period.
This is the figure of the small boy, the farthest over in the group. But it's going the wrong direction.
It doesn't look the same,
No.
stylistically.
So that's now something,
It's in between.
something again.
Because it's not part of that figure.
Yeah.
That's out too far to be shoulder line. And it certainly couldn't fit on the body that way. Do you have this, more of this area? Like in their contrasts of light and dark, the X-rays reveal the existence of several figures beneath the surface. Now, do you see what's there?
There's an arm,
Yeah, there it is.
but there's nothing that corresponds
So,
to it on the painting.
Seeing this bent arm and torso, there is no doubt that the figure can be connected with the standing harlequin in the center of the earlier gouache. This suggests that the entire circus family composition described by Fernand Olivier may in fact be beneath the surface of the picture. In order to explore this possibility, it's necessary to X-ray the entire composition. But that's beautifully preserved.
Mm-hmm.
An X-ray can only reveal an underimage in a black and white pattern. In order to find out what colors Picasso might have used, it is possible to take microscopic paint samples from the picture. Since it's now pretty clear that it does correspond to the print, let's see what evidence is here that supports that idea. The man in the center, I think, is probably only hinted at by the standing harlequin. The composite reveals the extraordinary existence of major elements of the gouache in all portions of the picture. Now, the all-important girl on the ball, which Fernand Olivier.
Right here.
She's right
You can see
there.
the line over her, of the end of her leotard,
Mm-hmm.
and her feet going down to the ball.
Right. But where the ball is right...
Right here. Here's her hip. There's her waist, and the ball is down there.
White paint, being the most dense, shows up most strongly in an X-ray. And thus the white horse is clearly visible as a broad pattern of white markings. In another area, a small child carrying firewood is visible at the outer margin. The Harlequin standing hands on hips is clearly visible, including the line of his tunic costume and the curve of his neck. Even more surprising is the head, which is so beautifully preserved, because it cannot be connected to either the early study or to any of the imagery we now see in the picture. It must, in fact, be connected to another image beneath the surface of the picture. A middle layer exists. This second layer contained two boys standing in a landscape, figures who match in reversed form an image known in a gouache, which we can, in fact, date to March 1905. This face is clearly independent from the picture and really belongs to the second state, we can say that. And it corresponds with the head
up there.
That's up there, also from the two acrobats' style. Now I noticed in particular the broad forehead that figure has, which does correspond almost exactly. So Picasso probably took that image and just flipped it, reversed it, turned it around. No horse race.
No.
And no dog in here. That
I mean, those things could be here, but they may have been painted in pigments that aren't dense.
Yeah.
And that's simply all that an X-ray is picking up.
Right. What about color samples? Where were they taken and how do they correspond?
We thought might be most useful was to take one through her leotard, since we knew from the gouache that was pink. And you can see, here we have a slide of the sample.
Right.
You can see the pink layer, which it's hard to imagine can be anything else but a bright pink leotard.
No, but it corresponds exactly. I mean, it's even the same kind of pink. If we describe the stages in the painting, Picasso first paints an enlargement of the gouache showing the girl balancing on the ball. This is probably done in the fall of 1904. Probably in March of 1905. This circus family composition is painted out and replaced by a second composition showing two boys standing in an empty landscape. At a later point, this composition is revised. It's there. And probably the sequence is for these two to be here, but in a larger proportion, and they're reduced, changed slightly. And then these two figures are added pretty much in this costume, holding a bag, wearing a top hat. The top hat is still visible up in here. And his arms down, moved up in a later stage. Then the girl is added, blocking out this whole area of his foot, and probably with a dog instead of the basket. Basket's then changed. And then finally she's moved in to the lower corner. It's probably a very late addition because the painting contains three totally different compositions, one of which, the final one, evolved through two stages. Discoveries of this nature can mean many things, ranging from rewriting our understanding of this crucial year in Picasso's life to the simple changing of a date on the label next to the picture. It should now date from late 1904. It may be October. We know that he was going to the circus as early as December 7th, 1904, because that's when Grach, a famous comedian, debuted at the Cirque Medrano, and it's recorded in Fernand Olivier's diaries that once Grach was there, they never missed an evening, so that the picture probably took up to 15 months to complete.
Extraordinary. Just a big hunk out of his creative life. Think of all the other changes that were happening in his own approach to things.
Picasso had one kind of image in his mind for the picture, one idea. And then I think this episode happened in his life with the child and saw the picture as a metaphor and put the slightest changes in, not major changes, but all the ones that add a strange opposite quality to the picture.
You feel there is a kind of tension by virtue of this open space, and that this girl has been frozen out, has been isolated.
And we know also that this funny little water pitcher, in her memoirs, Olivier talks about meeting Picasso, where they all came with large pitchers to gather water outside the Bateau de Bois. And I think that's an emblem for her. That's in effect Picasso saying, oh yes, that's where I met her, she was carrying that large water jug, so to speak. And it becomes a kind of private emblem in the same way that he's painted himself as Harlequin, which was his own private symbolism.
But there's also the language of gesture. I think this left hand of Picasso reaching around sort of behind his back, and the gap between the fingertips and the little girl.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a wonderful emblem of the kind of emotion that Picasso might have been going through with the idea of this girl having to be returned to the orphanage.
Yeah. The other thing about this figure is that terracotta color. I mean, it's there in the vase, water pitcher, but it's also there in that figure, in the skirt down here. The rest of the figures don't have that quality. So that, in effect, she's added later, and she already predicts what's going to happen to a certain degree just by that shift in tonality.
That's what fascinates me about this picture, that in a way it's such a summary, that the discoveries that you've made in terms of the layering in Picasso's execution of it are, in a sense, emblematic of his development as an artist. And he goes from this first stage, which is a sort of family document of circus life, to this very monumental study of two people beginning to have this sense of isolation, to this enormously rich final production, which in many ways speaks volumes about the modern artist, his alienation from society, and the human emotions of people not being able to communicate with other people.
We now know that rather than being simply part of the early Rose period, the family of Saltimbanques embraces the entire period. The mysterious charting of the early Rose period is solved. Indeed, at the end of painting the family of Saltimbanques, Picasso has become a modern artist.